That soldier girl is so pathetic. Just hand over the papers and she'll obediently sign away all the land so her cheap sister can marry into our family. Truly, a mindless machine. That is what Julian, my sister's perfect fiancé, just chuckled softly in French to his parents. Right at the engagement dinner table, he tenderly kissed Chloe's hand while throwing a look of utter disdain at my army badge. That entire family flew in from Europe, mocking me throughout the dinner, absolutely certain I was just a deaf grunt who couldn't understand a word of their language. My heart twisted violently as I realized they were setting a trap to steal everything from my sister. But they had no idea I had survived 4 years in the most brutal NATO combat zones. I slowly placed my fork down on the table, locking my ice-cold gaze onto the 3 people across from me. My finger tapped a silent 3-beat Morse code countdown. They had just messed with the wrong army major. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if the story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. The waiter had just finished pouring the drinks under the warm amber glow of the restaurant's crystal chandeliers when my sister's fiancé's father made his first move. Arthur Laurent reached across the pristine white tablecloth and picked up the bottle of wine I had carefully selected. He didn't hold it like a beverage. He held it by the neck as if he were inspecting a diseased rat. His cold, calculating eyes scanned the label with pure, unadulterated disgust. He placed the bottle down as if it had contaminated his space, and when he finally spoke, his voice dripped with a thick, syrupy condescension, the syllables heavy with the judgment of a man who believed his wealth made him a god. "Rebecca, is this the wine you chose? In our family, no one drinks this newly emerged American wine with fine duck. It ruins the entire flavor profile." I kept my calloused hands folded perfectly in my lap, feeling the familiar icy rush of adrenaline that always precedes a firefight. The battlefield had changed, but the enemy's intent was perfectly clear. I did not flinch. I did not let the heat rise to my cheeks. Instead, my mind flashed to the years I spent scraping by just to put food on the table for Chloe after our parents were tragically killed. I remembered my hands blistered raw, at 19 scrubbing industrial floors, on a military base wiring every spare cent home so Chloe could eat something other than canned soup. I remembered the empty fridge, the overdue electricity bills taped to the kitchen wall, and the night I sat in a recruiting office signing my life over to the army because it was the only way to keep my baby sister alive. I chose this wine because it was efficient and highly rated, the same way I chose everything in my life by weighing survival against cost. I learned that math the night 2 state troopers knocked on our apartment door and told a 15-year-old me that a drunk driver had crossed the center line on Route 9 and killed both my parents instantly. Chloe was 5. She was sitting on the kitchen floor, drawing horses with a broken crayon, when I knelt down and became her mother in the space of a single sentence. Every decision I made from that moment forward was a calculation designed to keep her alive and whole. This wine was a reflection of the very practicality that kept my family breathing when no one else cared enough to help. I squared my shoulders, keeping my voice as level and emotionless as a standard mission briefing. Actually, it's a highly rated Napa Valley wine, a practical and strong choice. Arthur scoffed loudly, slamming the base of his crystal glass onto the table to ensure everyone heard his displeasure. His lip curled into a sneer of absolute inherited superiority. Ah, how brutal. Typical of those used to violence. The word brutal echoed in my head. He used it to describe a beverage entirely ignorant of the actual bone-crushing brutality I had witnessed in combat zones, just to secure the freedom that allowed him to sit here and critique my palate. I thought about the convoy ambush outside Kabul, the ringing in my ears that lasted 3 days, the corporal I carried over my shoulder through 800 meters of open ground, while rounds snapped past my helmet. That was brutal. A California Cabernet was not. I swallowed the rage, forcing a tight, polite nod. The phantom smell of cordite and hot sand crept into the back of my nostrils, clashing violently with the overpowering, sickeningly sweet cloud of Genevieve's French perfume that hung over the entire table like a chemical weapon. My sister's fiancé's mother, Genevieve. instantly sensed the blood in the water, and moved in for the kill. She leaned forward, that heavy perfume wafting across the roasted duck. Her eyes dragged over my perfectly pressed dress uniform, pausing to look at the medals I bled for, with a look of profound aristocratic pity. She tilted her head, feigning innocent curiosity, while aiming directly for my throat. "And what exactly do you do in the military, Rebecca? I heard you just stay in stuffy barracks." She delivered the line smoothly speaking, as if my entire existence was a shameful, uncultured stain on her elegant evening, equating my service to cleaning latrines. I refused to break eye contact. I locked my gaze with hers, deliberately projecting the heavy, unyielding authority of my rank, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second to establish dominance. "I am a U.S. Army major. I specialize in tactical analysis and commanding combat operations." I enunciated every single word, ensuring she understood that I did not sit in a barracks. I orchestrated the survival of hundreds of lethal operators across 4 continents. Genevieve didn't retreat. Her arrogance was far too deeply entrenched. She took a delicate, theatrical sip of her sparkling water, completely unimpressed by a title that commanded respect from generals. She waved her manicured hand in a dismissive, fluttering gesture. How rigid and inglorious. A pity for a woman. With one breath, she casually dismissed my entire life sacrifice, treating my survival and my leadership as a tragic failure of femininity. The word inglorious burned in my chest. I thought about the men and women I brought home in flag-draped caskets. The truest glory this vain, shallow woman would never comprehend. I thought about Sergeant Williams, 22 years old, who told me the night before the ambush that he wanted to be a high school football coach when he got home. He never got home. That was inglorious. My command was the reason 37 other soldiers did get home. I gripped the stem of my water glass so tightly the crystal groaned under the pressure. But I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my honor. Doing so would ruin the dinner for Chloe. Instead, I took a slow breath, switching my mindset entirely from defense to active reconnaissance. I began mapping their psychological weaknesses, noting their blind arrogance, and preparing for a long, quiet war. Midway through the main course, the power dynamic at the table shifted drastically. Arthur leaned over and whispered a raspy, guttural sentence in French to Genevieve, his eyes darting toward me with a smirk, assuming I was an uneducated, uncultured American grunt who only knew how to follow orders. Genevieve switched the conversation entirely to French. Like flipping a switch, they stripped away my basic human rights at the table. They treated me like an invisible, deaf piece of furniture, entirely excluded from their high society language. What they didn't know was that my silence was an active camouflage. I did not let a single facial muscle twitch to betray the fact that I had survived 4 brutal years of joint NATO operation, speaking nothing but fluent tactical French. I had negotiated hostage releases in Marseille and coordinated airstrikes with French special forces in the Sahel, all in the exact language they were now using to gossip about my table manners. I kept my eyes blank, chewing my food methodically, letting the heavy syllables wash over me. I was a ghost at my own table, collecting every vicious word they said and filing it into my mental targeting system. Genevieve turned her predatory gaze toward my younger sister. Chloe was absolutely glowing that night, wearing a simple, elegant dress she had spent weeks saving up for from her modest pottery studio earnings. She had shown me the dress 3 days earlier, spinning in the kitchen like she was 16, again asking me if it was good enough. I recognized the brand. It was the same discount department store where I used to buy her school clothes, with whatever was left of my military paycheck after rent and groceries. She could afford better now, but she chose this dress because she said it reminded her of the ones I used to pick out for her when she was little. I told her she looked like a queen. She blushed and hugged me so hard my ribs creaked. She whispered into my shoulder that she wanted to make a good impression on Julian's family, that she wanted them to see she was worthy. The memory of those words burned through me now like acid. Now Genevieve flashed a warm, maternal, utterly fake smile at her, reaching out to gently pat Chloe's arm while looking right into my sister's trusting, innocent eyes. Genevieve spat out in rapid French, "Jolie pour du prêt porter de bas étage." Pretty for a cheap, ready-to-wear piece. My jaw locked so hard I tasted copper in the back of my throat. Chloe snorts, thinking she had just received a blessing from her future mother-in-law, blushed deeply, and whispered a sweet thank you. The urge to reach across the table, grab Genevieve by the throat, and expose her cruelty was nearly blinding. My heart rate spiked, but I instantly executed a 4-count tactical breathing exercise, forcing my heart rate back down. I would not ruin Chloe's moment. I would swallow this poison so she didn't have to. My men in the desert would have died to protect my flank. These people sat at my table, eating my food, and casually stabbed my sister in the back with every syllable. The mockery continued, emboldened by my apparent ignorance. Arthur watched me lift my glass to take a sip of water. He subtly mimicked my rigid, disciplined posture, exaggerating his movements to make Genevieve giggle behind her expensive silk napkin. The sheer absurdity of these soft, pampered people mocking a trained soldier was infuriating. Genevieve leaned over to her husband, her eyes fixed on me with malicious, unfiltered glee. Look at her, stiff as a gun barrel. The ridiculous gestures of a trigger puller with absolutely no aura of a real woman. They fired these sugar-coated venomous bullets right across my plate, completely confident in their impenetrable linguistic armor. They defined a real woman by the price of her jewelry and the softness of her hands. They had no concept that my stiffness came from carrying the weight of my sister's survival on my back for 15 years. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a physical reaction. I did not slump my shoulders. I did not look away. And I certainly did not glare. Instead, I rested my right hand flat on the table near my plate. My index finger began tapping a silent, steady Morse code rhythm against the heavy linen tablecloth. 3 beats. It was a mental grounding technique, a way to build an impenetrable fortress around my escalating rage. I stopped looking at them as future family members and started viewing them purely as enemy combatants on a battlefield, freely broadcasting their positions over an open radio channel. The coldness that settled over me was absolute. Every insult they hurled, every condescending laugh they shared, was a vital piece of intelligence. They thought they were humiliating me, but they were willingly handing me the exact ammunition I would use to obliterate them. As the main course was cleared, Genevieve's wandering eyes locked onto the wall behind the hostess stand, where a framed photo of Chloe's pottery studio hung proudly. Center frame was the heavy solid oak desk I had built for her. I spent my only 2 weeks of military leave last year, my hands blistered and bleeding sanding and joining that wood, so Chloe would have a sturdy place to create her art. I hauled the raw lumber in the bed of my truck, cut every joint by hand in the garage, and sealed it with 3 coats of varnish while Chloe was asleep, so it would be a surprise. Genevieve pointed at the photo with a manicured nail and scoffed loudly in French. Look at that crude piece of trash. These Americans truly have no aesthetic sense. They just violently patch pieces of wood together and proudly call it art. I stopped chewing. I slowly lowered my silver fork, placing it down onto the porcelain plate. The snort's sharp metallic click cut cleanly through the ambient noise of the restaurant. If anyone truly understood me in the military, they would know that this sudden extreme silence was the definitive signal of an incoming devastating airstrike. That desk was not furniture. It was proof that I loved my sister more than my own rest, more than my own body, more than any vacation I would ever take. Genevieve had just spat on the most sacred thing I had ever built with my own 2 hands. The petty insults rapidly evolved from merely offensive to financially lethal. 20 minutes later, just as the waiters served dessert, Genevieve leaned closely toward her son Julian, her demeanor shifting from arrogant to strictly business. She dropped her voice, asking in rapid, hushed French, "Les papiers sont-ils prêts? Are the papers ready?" Julian didn't even bother looking up from his chamomile tea. He stirred it lazily, a picture of absolute relaxed confidence. "L'avocat de la fiducie la semaine prochaine." The trust lawyer next week. The air instantly vanished from my lungs. My combat instincts flared up, connecting the dots with terrifying speed. Papers, a trust lawyer. This wasn't a joyful wedding celebration. This was a calculated boardroom acquisition. They weren't here to welcome Chloe into their family. They were laying the groundwork to steal the commercial real estate we inherited from our parents, the only tangible piece of our mother and father we had left on this earth. Arthur chuckled darkly, driving the rusty knife even deeper into my back as he analyzed my behavior. That soldier sister is too desperate to see her sister marry into a prestigious family. How pathetic. And Julian? The man who looked me dead in the eye just 4 months ago and swore on his life to protect my sister laughed. He actually laughed, a cruel echoing sound that bounced off the restaurant walls. That's exactly why this plan will succeed perfectly. She is predictable, only knows how to follow orders, ready to sign anything to make her sister happy. A brain programmed by discipline will never know how to doubt. He laid out his entire sociopathic strategy in the open, fully believing I was too stupid to comprehend my own execution. He viewed my profound love and sacrifice for Chloe not as a strength, but as the exact weakness he would exploit to bankrupt us. I stared directly into the eyes of the man who was treating my baby sister like a disposable financial hostage. I did not flip the heavy wooden table, though every muscle in my body screamed to do so. I did not stand up and scream in his face. Instead, I calmly finished the last drop of my water, my expression freezing into a mask of absolute terrifying calm. My fingers stopped tapping the Morse code. The countdown was over. The target was acquired and firmly locked. They sat there sipping their expensive tea, thoroughly convinced they were hunting a helpless, obedient sheep. They were completely oblivious to the fact that they had just confidently locked themselves inside a cage with an apex predator. I would not just stop their plan. I would dismantle every brick of their fraudulent empire until the rubble was unrecognizable. They came to my table carrying the arrogance of a dynasty, and they would leave carrying nothing but the shame of their exposure. The torturous dinner finally drew to a close, and the waiter cleared the dessert plates. As we all stood up to leave the restaurant, Julian shifted gears instantly. The transition was sickening to watch. He seamlessly abandoned the hushed, conspiratorial French he had used to plot our financial ruin and switched back to loud, charming English. Like a sociopathic chameleon changing its colors, he wrapped his arm tightly around Chloe's waist, grabbing her hand with fake, overwhelming devotion. "Are you happy, my angel?" he asked, his voice dripping with synthetic honey, ensuring I heard him. I watched him manipulate her in real time, using her genuine affection as a shield. It took every ounce of my military discipline to force the corners of my mouth up. I played the fool perfectly. I shook Arthur's hand, nodded respectfully at Genevieve, and told them all what a truly wonderful evening it was. Julian pressed his lips to Chloe's forehead. Her eyes closed, and she leaned into him with absolute, unguarded trust. The sight of it nearly broke my composure. This was the same man who less than an hour ago had called her a cheap commodity in his mother tongue. He was a predator grooming his prey, and she was smiling. I needed them to walk out of those restaurant doors, firmly believing that they had completely won, that the stupid American soldier suspected absolutely nothing. After bidding them good night, I walked alone to the far unlit end of the parking lot. I climbed into the driver's seat of my dark SUV, leaving the engine off. The silence inside the cabin was deafening after 2 hours of listening to them butcher my family's dignity. I sat in the dark, my hands resting on my thighs, running a full mental debrief of the evening. I catalogued every insult, every smirk, every whispered French conspiracy, organizing them into a clean tactical chronology. The bottle of wine, the career assassination, the dress, the desk, the papers, the trust lawyer, the plan. Each one a link in a chain they had forged to drag my sister into financial slavery. Suddenly, my phone buzzed violently in the cup holder, shattering the quiet. The screen lit up with a text message from Chloe. I opened it. "Sis, thank you for tonight. You dropping your strictness to try and blend in with his family means the world to me." I read the words twice, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. My chest tightened so fiercely I could barely draw a breath. She truly believed they loved her. She thought they were her future. She thought I was being stiff and awkward because I was trying to impress them, not because I was fighting every instinct in my body to protect her from the truth. I reached out and gripped the freezing leather steering wheel, squeezing it until my knuckles popped loudly in the quiet car. The heartbreak gave way to a cold, ruthless clarity. I can do anything for you, little girl, I whispered into the empty dark. The victim was gone. The hunter was awake. I dropped the subservient civilian act entirely. I reached deep into the center console of the SUV and pulled out my secondary encrypted military phone, a secure line I hadn't needed to use in nearly 2 years. The phone was heavy, reinforced, ugly, and completely untraceable. I dialed a number entirely off the grid. The line rang twice, emitting a hollow digital tone before a dry, gravelly voice crackled through the speaker. Hayes speaking. It was my former military intelligence comrade, Marcus Hayes. He was a ghost in the cyber underworld, a man I trusted more than anyone on Earth. We had shared a foxhole in Afghanistan for 72 hours during a siege, surviving on stale crackers and each other's dry humor. The sound of his rough voice instantly grounded me, pulling me out of the suffocating, fake, high society world of the Laurence and plunging me right back into a war zone mentality. I sat up straighter in my seat, my posture rigid, my breathing controlled. I was no longer Chloe's awkward older sister trying to fit in. I was Major Rebecca Patel, and my perimeter had been severely breached by hostile forces. I did not bother with pleasantries. I gave the order, my voice pure, unyielding steel, echoing in the confined space of the SUV. Marcus, it's Rebecca. I need to activate an operation. I need you to use every underground network privilege to tear through the international financial background of the Laurent family French origin. I want their darkest data on my desk. Marcus didn't ask a single question. He didn't ask for context or hesitate. He understood the lethal gravity in my tone. He simply grunted a low acknowledgement, confirming the mission parameters, and the line went dead. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. I stared at the dark windshield for a long moment, visualizing the tactical map of what was about to happen. I reached forward, shoved the key into the ignition, and threw the heavy SUV into gear, peeling out of the parking lot. The reconnaissance phase was officially over. The war for my family's survival had begun. It'd been 3 grueling weeks since the engagement dinner. The operation was in full swing. To destroy an enemy this arrogant, you must invite them inside the wire. The morning after the dinner, I had swallowed my bile, picked up the phone, and called Julian. I purposely pitched my voice high, softening my commanding tone to play the eager, painfully naive sister who just wanted to please him. Julian, I was thinking, why don't your parents move into the guest house on our Patel estate? It snorts saves them the commute from the hotel. I want us to truly be a family. He accepted the offer instantly. The raw, naked greed in his voice was palpable through the receiver. He put me on hold for 8 seconds. I heard him whisper rapidly to Arthur in French, the words tumbling over each other in breathless excitement. He came back on the line with that perfectly rehearsed warmth, thanking me for my generosity, calling me the most wonderful sister he could ever ask for. He thought his psychological manipulation from the previous night had worked flawlessly. He firmly believed I had completely surrendered my territory, totally unaware that he was eagerly walking his family straight into the belly of my Trojan horse. Arthur and Genevieve moved into the guest house that weekend, and I instantly turned my own inherited estate into a live hostile intelligence grid. I played the oblivious idiot perfectly every single day. I served them bitter black coffee on the patio while they loudly criticized my boring barracks interior decor in rapid French, assuming I was too uncultured to understand. Genevieve complained about the thread count of the sheets I had provided, demanding I replace them with Egyptian cotton. Arthur made a show of wiping down the kitchen counter with his own handkerchief before setting his plate down, as if my home was unsanitary. On the 4th day, Genevieve discovered Chloe's handmade ceramic mugs in the guest kitchen cabinet. She held one up to the light with 2 fingers, as if handling a dead insect, and announced in French that she would rather drink from a paper cup than put her lips on peasant artillery. That afternoon, I found the mugs in the trash can wrapped in paper towels. I fished them out, washed them, and returned them to the cabinet without a word. On the 9th day, I overheard Arthur tell Julian on the phone that the guest house plumbing was barbaric, and that Americans built homes the way they built their military, loud, crude, and temporary. I smiled through all of it, nodding, pouring refills. playing the dutiful hostess while mentally recording every grievance for the final invoice. I stood quietly in the kitchen one morning, washing dishes by hand, watching through the window as Arthur paced the perimeter of our commercial lot. The sharp mechanical snap of his metal measuring tape echoed across the yard. He was aggressively calculating square footage, his eyes glowing with a ravenous, desperate greed. He pulled a small leather notebook from his back pocket and scribbled numbers furiously, occasionally pausing to photograph the property boundary markers with his phone. He walked the entire eastern fence line, stopping at each corner post, extending the tape, and noting the measurements with the precision of a demolition contractor. He was literally measuring my family's land for a coffin, calculating how quickly he could liquidate our history to save his own skin, while I stood just 50 feet away, wiping down the counters, with a damp rag memorizing every move he made. One humid afternoon, while I was kneeling in the dirt, sweating profusely, as I pruned the thorny rose bushes near the guest house, Arthur stepped out onto the second-story balcony directly above me. He leaned heavily against the railing, looking out over the sprawling acreage with the hungry eyes of a man appraising a meal. He dialed his phone and whispered in French to Genevieve, who was inside. "This land will solve the entire problem." He said it with the profound relief of a drowning man who had just spotted a life raft. I kept my head down, clipping the thick stems, wiping the sweat and dirt from my forehead with the back of my glove. I acted like the only thing I could hear was the chirping of the birds and the crunch of my shears. A thorn pierced through my glove and drew blood from my thumb. I did not flinch. My tactical discipline was flawless. A moment later, Genevieve stepped out onto the balcony to join her husband. She held a delicate teacup, looking down at my muddy combat boots and stained jeans. A cruel sneer plastered across her face as she watched me work the soil. "That soldier girl has no idea she's sitting on a gold mine," she replied in French, laughing coldly at my apparent peasant-like ignorance. I stopped clipping. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the sun, and waved at them like a cheerful, obedient fool, flashing a wide, ignorant smile. They nodded back, entirely satisfied with their superiority. Let them laugh. They were digging their own graves right in my backyard, utterly convinced they had conquered my home. The trap was set, and they were standing right in the center of the kill box. If you've ever had to bite your tongue and play the fool while toxic people showed their true colors right in front of you, hit the like button right now. Tell me in the comments, how did you finally expose their lies and set your trap? Late on a Thursday night, my office was pitch black save for the eerie, sterile blue glow of my computer monitor. Marcus Hayes finally penetrated their firewalls and delivered the highly encrypted dossier directly to my secure inbox. I opened the files, and the truth hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. The Laurent family's aristocratic facade was a complete, elaborate lie. They were entirely bankrupt. Arthur owed millions in French taxes, and the government had already frozen his remaining European assets. Their villa in Provence had been seized 6 months ago by the French tax authority. Their Paris apartment was under lien, with 3 separate banks holding claims against it. The Snorts family wine collection, the one Arthur had bragged about at dinner as if it were a sacred heirloom, had been auctioned off 2 years prior to cover a fraction of his mounting debts. The same man who mocked my Napa Valley wine had been secretly drinking grocery store bottles for the last 24 months. Genevieve's diamond necklace, the one she wore like a crown, was flagged in a separate insurance fraud investigation. Marcus had even unearthed Arthur's private correspondence with a real estate broker in Miami, dated just 2 weeks before the engagement, inquiring about the market value of commercial land parcels in our exact zip code. The conspiracy was premeditated down to the last decimal point. But it was Julian's file that made my blood run cold. He was facing a massive, catastrophic civil lawsuit for financial fraud in France. He had stolen from his investors, running a Ponzi-style scheme through a network of shell companies registered in Luxembourg and the Channel Islands. He was facing prison time. Chloe was nothing but an economic hostage, a desperate Hail Mary to secure American real estate capital to keep them all out of jail. The marriage was never about love. It was a liquidation strategy. The sheer scale of the financial massacre they were attempting against us was horrifying. I saved every file onto an encrypted external drive, locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk, and sat in the dark for a full minute, letting the cold fury crystallize into something sharp and precise. On Sunday morning, the enemy officially made their move. I was sitting quietly on the front porch, carefully applying black polish to my combat boots, the rhythmic motion of the brush grounding my nerves. Arthur approached me carrying a thick, heavy leather binder. He wore the polished, trustworthy smile of a seasoned diplomat. He sat next to me, crossing one leg over the other, and placed the binder between us on the wooden bench. His snort's voice was smooth and reassuring. "Rebecca, Julian and Chloe are about to officially be family. In the European elite, we always have a tradition of protecting family assets. I had a lawyer draft a family trust, a legal structure to ensure your commercial land is safe, and Chloe's future is absolutely secured. I want you to look it over." He handed me the binder. The weight of it in my hands was the physical manifestation of their crime. The leather was expensive, the kind of wrapping you put around a gift when you want someone to feel special before you rob them blind. I held the bait, suppressing the overwhelming urge to hurl it back into his face. I took the binder and slowly flipped through the dense, convoluted legal jargon. I purposely furrowed my brow, projecting deep confusion. I scratched the back of my head, playing the dense, uneducated foot soldier to absolute perfection. I looked up at him, my expression blank. "Arthur, to be honest, these trust structures are too complex. I'm only used to reading target coordinates, but if it's good for Chloe, I will nod. Let me hold on to this draft to look over." I smiled warmly, offering him the blind trust of a desperate sister. Arthur nodded, unable to hide the triumphant predatory smirk creeping across his face as he turned and walked away. He firmly believed the hook was set. He thought he had completely bypassed my defenses. He didn't notice that my thumb had already photographed every single page of the document against my thigh. As I flipped through it, transmitting the images directly to David Sterling's encrypted inbox before Arthur had even reached the guest house door. That night, under the cover of darkness, my private state attorney, David Sterling, a former JAG officer, arrived at my office through the back gate. He snorts carried his own battered leather briefcase, the one he had used in 3 military tribunals and a congressional hearing. He reviewed the binder page by page with surgical precision, cross-referencing it against Marcus's intel on a second laptop. After 40 minutes of silent reading, he tossed the heavy document onto my desk with a sickening thud, utterly disgusted. "This is a perfect trap, Rebecca. It's not a protection fund. It's a sophisticated cross-collateralization agreement. If you sign this, you're authorizing Julian to use your land as collateral for his family's foreign debts. When they default, and according to your intel, they already have, the bank will automatically foreclose on your land. You and Chloe will lose everything." The reality of their malice crystallized. Every late-night conversation, every condescending smile, every fake compliment aimed at Chloe. All of it was a carefully constructed noose designed to hang us with our own generosity. I stood up, cold fury icing my veins, transforming me from a sister back into a commander. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor. I placed both fists flat on the desk and leaned forward, locking eyes with David. "I don't just want to cancel it. I want to destroy them. I want to smash their arrogance and their hypocritical facade." David pulled a legal pad from his briefcase and clicked his pen. He didn't flinch. He had spent 15 years in military law, and this was the exact kind of surgical strike he lived for. We worked through the night, mapping every piece of evidence against the Lawrence, preparing the full dossier for public deployment. The plan was simple, elegant, and absolutely merciless. David would prepare a counter dossier with certified translations of the French court filings, Arthur's tax liens, and Julian's fraud charges, all time-stamped and notarized. I would let Arthur believe I was going to sign his fake trust. I would give him the stage he craved, the public ceremony, the audience, the champagne, and then I would use that stage to execute their reputation in front of every person they were trying to impress. David called it a controlled, I called it justice. I had flawlessly sealed the trap on Monday afternoon. I found Arthur lounging in the garden, reading a French newspaper he had ordered delivered to my address at my expense. I approached him smiling, like an obedient, subservient child eager for validation. Arthur, your family is so thoughtful. I want to prove the honor of the Patel family. Let's hold a public contract signing ceremony at the rehearsal dinner this weekend in front of all the guests. He agreed instantly, completely blinded by his own insatiable greed. His eyes widened with a barely concealed euphoria, and he shook my hand with both of his squeezing too hard, the way a con artist does when he believes the mark has finally walked into the trap. He immediately pulled out his phone and began texting Julian, his fingers trembling with excitement. I turned away from him and walked calmly across the lawn toward the main house. My face was stone. The bait was swallowed. The detonator was armed. He had 4 days to enjoy his fake victory. Now Saturday night had arrived. The sprawling garden was illuminated with string lights, filled with over 40 guests. I had specifically ensured the guest list was heavily populated by the grounded working-class artists from Chloe's Ceramics Club, the exact type of unpretentious creatives the Lawrence secretly despised. Julian was working the crowd effortlessly, playing the role of the perfect wealthy European prince. He complimented the artwork on display, pretended to know the difference between stoneware and porcelain, and shook hands with a practiced politician-grade warmth that made my skin crawl. Arthur and Genevieve sat regally at the head table, sipping champagne, radiating a nauseating aura of smug superiority. They looked at my home as if they already held the deed. Arthur had even brought a fountain pen, the pretentious kind, with a gold nib specifically for the signing ceremony. He placed it on the table like a trophy. Genevieve had chosen her most expensive necklace for the occasion, a thick rope of diamonds that caught the string lights and threw tiny white sparks across the tablecloth. When the time came, I stood up. I was not wearing civilian clothes. I was wearing my full immaculate military dress uniform, every hard-earned medal and ribbon perfectly aligned on my chest. I had pressed the fabric myself that morning, running the iron over every crease until the lines were sharp enough to cut glass. I projected the heavy, undeniable physical presence of a combat commander as I stepped up to the wooden podium. David Sterling stood quietly in the deep shadows near the ivy trellis, holding the original damning intelligence dossier in his briefcase, one hand resting on the clasp. I raised my hand and tapped my fingernail against the microphone. The sharp, abrasive screech cut through the ambient chatter and clinking glasses like a blade. The entire garden fell dead silent, all eyes turning to me. I looked over the crowd, my voice calm and resonant in English. Ladies and gentlemen, today the Laurent family brought us a contract. They call it protection, but I, as the head of this family, want to thank them in their own mother tongue, to return the respect they have shown me over the past 3 weeks. I watched Arthur's face from the corner of my eye. He was beaming, nodding along, completely misreading my words as gratitude. Genevieve adjusted her diamond necklace and sat up straighter, preparing to bask in the public praise she believed was coming. Julian placed his hand possessively on Chloe's knee under the table, already planning how to spend the money he was about to steal from her. I turned my head slowly, locking my gaze directly with Arthur. The silence in the garden grew heavy, suffocating. I drew a slow, measured breath and delivered the lethal blow in flawless, commanding, military-grade French. Je vais commencer le jugement. I will begin the sentencing. The physical reaction was instantaneous and violently catastrophic. Genevieve's champagne glass slipped entirely from her manicured fingers, shattering violently across the hard stone patio, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot across the hushed garden. Arthur's smug, diplomatic smile vanished instantly. The blood drained from his face, leaving him ghostly pale. His jaw hanging open, his golden fountain pen rolling forgotten off the edge of the table. Julian physically stumbled backward in his chair, his knees slamming against the underside of the table, rattling every glass and plate. His snort's eyes went wide with sheer unadulterated panic as the realization hit him like a freight train. The deaf grunt spoke French. The mindless machine had understood every single word. I leaned closely into the microphone, unleashing hell in French. my voice echoing off the trees and the stone walls of my own home. For the past 3 weeks, you treated me like an idiot. You insulted my sister, mocked my home, and schemed to use the label of marriage to steal my family's land. The sheer shock of hearing their secret weapon, their language turned against them, with the precision and authority of a military tribunal, paralyzed them completely in their seats. Genevieve clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles bone white, her carefully constructed mask of aristocratic elegance crumbling in real time. Her diamond necklace suddenly looked cheap costume jewelry draped over a fraud. Arthur grabbed his wife's arm, his fingers digging into her sleeve, his lips moving but producing no sound. I immediately pivoted away from the trembling Lawrence, facing the shocked crowd of artists and friends. I switched back to English, ensuring every single person in the garden understood the depth of the crime. My voice boomed across the lawn with the undeniable destructive force of heavy artillery. They assumed I didn't understand French, but I heard every single word. This contract is not a trust fund. It is a power of attorney to clear debts. A wave of horrified gasps rippled through the crowd. Chairs scraped against the stone patio as guests shifted in their seats, craning their necks to see the Laurent faces. Chloe's ceramics teacher, a 60-year-old woman with clay permanently under her fingernails, pressed her hand over her mouth. A young artist near the back stood up, his jaw tight with anger, shaking his head slowly. Julian's carefully cultivated friendships with the guests evaporated in a single breath. The same people who had shaken his hand and complimented his charm 20 minutes earlier now stared at him with the raw contempt reserved for thieves caught in the act. I gestured to David, who stepped forward from the shadows, his expression cold and professional. He opened his briefcase, pulled out the thick dossier, and placed it firmly into my outstretched hand. Snorts. I grabbed it and slammed it down onto the wooden podium, the heavy thud ringing out across the garden like a judge's gavel. The Laurent family is bankrupt. Arthur is drowning in tax debt, and Julian, the perfect fiancé, is being sued for financial fraud in France. He needs Chloe's land to save his own pathetic life. The absolute destruction of their fake aristocratic facade was executed flawlessly, right in front of the very people they had looked down upon. Every Snorts artist, every friend, every working-class creative who had ever been made to feel small by someone like the Laurent stared at the head table with a disgust that no amount of expensive champagne could wash away. Arthur's fountain pen sat on the ground where it had rolled, stepped on, and cracked by his own panicked foot. Absolute unbridled chaos erupted across the garden. The artists were whispering furiously to one another, pointing and staring at the Laurent family with utter unfiltered disgust. Chloe's best friend from the ceramics club stood up and physically turned her chair away from Julian, refusing to even share the same sightline with him. Julian looked around, realizing his entire lifeline, his freedom from a French prison, was burning down right in front of his eyes. The suave, untouchable, arrogant businessman persona vanished, entirely replaced by the pathetic franticness of a cornered rat. He lunged forward, breaking his character completely as he rushed toward Chloe. He grabbed desperately for her arm, his eyes wide and leaking panic. "Chloe, listen to me explain," he stammered, his voice cracking and trembling under the crushing weight of his impending financial and legal ruin. He expected her to crumble, to cry, and to blindly accept whatever lies he was about to frantically invent to save his own skin. I tensed my muscles, fully prepared to step between them and physically intercept him, but Chloe didn't need me to. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse into hysterics. The unbreakable steel spine I had spent a decade helping her forge through our shared hardship finally snapped securely into place. She violently ripped her arm out of his grasp, her eyes blazing with a fury I had never seen in her before. She reached down, yanked the heavy diamond engagement ring off her finger, and hurled it like a rock, bouncing it with a heavy thud right off his chest. "Get away from me. You called me a cheap commodity. Now take your rotting inheritance and get out." Her visceral physical rejection of him was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. She didn't mourn the loss of the fake prince. She rejected the parasite. The ring bounced off his sternum and skittered across the stone patio, coming to rest near Arthur's polished shoe. Julian staggered backward, his mouth open, his hands hanging limply at his sides. The diamond sat on the cold stone, catching the string lights, worthless now, a piece of costume jewelry from a bankrupt con artist. Chloe stood tall, her shoulders squared, her chin raised, her potter's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The same hands that shaped delicate ceramic bowls and vases had just thrown a diamond ring with the force and precision of a fastball. She turned her back on Julian completely, a gesture that was more devastating than any word she could have spoken. She did not apologize. She did not explain. She stood there like the woman I had raised her to be, unbroken, unbowed, and absolutely finished with anyone who dared to use her love as a weapon against her family. Arthur was stammering incoherently in French, grasping the edge of his table, and Genevieve was openly, pathetically sobbing into her expensive hands. The thick mascara she had so carefully applied that evening ran in black streaks down her cheeks, destroying the flawless European facade she had spent 60 years constructing. Their impenetrable, arrogant, aristocratic pride was completely and permanently obliterated. I stepped down from the podium, my boots clicking sharply against the stone. I reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of paper. I marched directly up to Arthur, entirely ignoring his pathetic whimpering, and shoved the paper flat against his chest. Here is the bill for your living expenses at my house. And here is an order to evict the entire Laurent family from my territory first thing tomorrow morning. Otherwise, I will call the police for trespassing. I delivered the lines with the cold, absolute authority of a commanding officer, dismissing hostile, defeated forces from a secured battlefield. Arthur's trembling fingers closed around the paper. His eyes scanned the itemized list of every meal, every cup of coffee, every kilowatt of electricity his parasitic family had consumed under my roof for 3 weeks. The total was modest, but the message was devastating. They were not guests. They were occupiers, and their occupation was over. They scrambled. The highly polished superior European elites ran from the garden like rats, fleeing a sinking ship, violently shoving past the disgusted guests who refused to make way for them. Julian tripped over a chair leg and caught himself on a table, knocking over a vase of wildflowers that Chloe had arranged that morning. Genevieve kicked off her designer heels and ran barefoot across the wet grass, clutching her silk wrap around her shoulders, her sobs echoing across the dark property. Arthur shuffled behind them. The eviction notice crumpled in his fist. His proud spine bent under the weight of total public humiliation. I did not look back at them as they disappeared into the dark. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms securely around Chloe, shielding her from the stares of the remaining crowd. She leaned her head heavily onto my shoulder. She was trembling from the adrenaline dump, but she was safe. The hostile threat had been entirely neutralized. David Sterling collected the dossier from the podium, closed his briefcase clean snap, and gave me a single firm nod from across the garden before disappearing through the back gate. Marcus Hayes, who had been watching the entire operation unfold from the dark edge of the property line unseen and unannounced, sent a single encrypted text to my phone. 2 words. Mission complete. We stood together in the quiet garden, 2 orphaned sisters who had just successfully defended our home against an invading army, completely victorious. The next morning, the guest house was entirely empty. I stood alone on the front porch, holding a warm mug of black coffee, watching the red taillights of their rushing rental car disappear down the long driveway for good. The eviction was complete. Arthur had loaded the car in the dark, refusing to make eye contact with me when I stepped outside at first light. Genevieve sat rigid in the passenger seat, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, clutching her purse like a life preserver. Julian was not with them. He had left separately hours earlier, slinking away in a taxi before dawn, like the coward he had always been beneath the expensive cologne. I walked slowly through the rooms they had occupied over the last 3 weeks. I aggressively pushed open every single window, letting the crisp, cold morning breeze rush in to air out the lingering toxic stench of Genevieve's heavy perfume and Arthur's cheap cigars. Cigarette burns marked the nightstand they had never bothered to use an ashtray for. A half-empty bottle of Arthur's cognac sat on the kitchen counter. I poured it down the sink and watched the amber liquid spiral down the drain. I wiped down every counter, scrubbed every surface, erasing any physical trace that they were ever here. I stripped the bedsheets, stuffed them into a black trash bag, and carried the bag straight to the outdoor bin. I stepped outside and pulled the front door shut behind me. The loud, definitive click of the deadbolt locking echoed in the quiet morning air. The perimeter was fully secured. I walked across the damp lawn and found Chloe working inside her pottery studio. She was sitting quietly at the very oak desk I had built for her, the exact desk Genevieve had so viciously called trash. She wasn't crying. She wasn't mourning the loss of the wedding or scrolling through old photos of Julian. She looked up at me, her hands covered in thick, wet, fresh clay, already aggressively molding a brand new beautiful piece. The muscles in her forearms flexed as she pressed the clay against the wheel, shaping something raw and unfinished into something strong. We didn't need to speak a single word. I walked over and rested my hand firmly on her shoulder. She reached up with her clean wrist and pressed it briefly against my fingers. The unspoken bond forged in the fire of our painful past was infinitely stronger than any lie Julian ever tried to sell her. She was rebuilding her life right here on the land. Our parents left us unbothered by the ghosts of the European aristocracy that tried to break her. The comforting smell of wet clay and fresh coffee filled the small studio, replacing the suffocating perfume that had poisoned our home for 3 long weeks. Later that afternoon, I sat in the garden with David Sterling and Marcus Hayes. We shared a quiet, victorious cup of coffee under the shade of the large oak tree. Marcus had driven in from the city at dawn, arriving with a paper bag of gas station donuts and a dry, wordless handshake that said everything. A small fire burned in the patio pit, where the fraudulent trust paperwork was slowly turning into gray ash. David fed the pages into the flames one by one, watching each clause, each predatory subparagraph, each carefully worded trap curl and blacken and disintegrate. I looked at my 2 military allies, my true brothers in arms who had dropped everything to help me execute this mission. And I realized a fundamental, undeniable truth. Family isn't about the blood running in your veins, and it certainly isn't about the prestigious name you carry. It's strictly about who stands shoulder to shoulder, with you holding the line when the artillery starts falling, and the world tries to take what is yours. Marcus raised his paper coffee cup in a mock toast. David cracked the first smile I had ever seen cross his face. The last page of the trust document caught a gust of air and floated upward, glowing orange at the edges before collapsing into nothing. Marcus leaned back in his chair and looked at me with the quiet, knowing expression of a man who had seen the very worst of humanity and still chose to show up when his people needed him. He didn't do this for money. He didn't do it for a favor. He did it because 15 years ago, I pulled him out of a burning vehicle in a firefight, and he swore he would return the debt. David did it because he believed the law existed to protect people like Chloe, not to be twisted into a weapon by people like the Laurents. These 2 men, bound to me by nothing but shared suffering and unshakable loyalty, had done more for my family in 3 weeks than the Laurent bloodline had done for anyone in 3 generations. I adjusted the collar of my civilian shirt, taking a deep, unburdened breath of the afternoon air. The heavy weight of the last month had finally lifted off my chest. From inside the studio, I could hear the soft, rhythmic hum of Chloe's pottery wheel, spinning the sound of creation, replacing the sound of destruction. I looked out across the property, across the land my parents had worked their entire lives to buy, the same dirt roads where my father taught me to ride a bike, the same garden where my mother grew tomatoes every summer, until the summer she never came home. This was the land I had bled to protect, the land Chloe would build her legacy on, the land no con artist in a tailored suit would ever touch again. I am a soldier, and I will always be a soldier. Let the elite world think I'm rigid. Let them think I'm just a predictable, mindless machine lacking culture and grace. Because when the wolves come knocking at my door, dressed in designer suits and speaking fluent French, trying to hurt the only family I have left, this machine will always know exactly how to load the weapon, acquire the target, and pull the trigger without a second thought. My family is safe, and the hunt is over. If you believe that true family is about loyalty and protection, not money and manipulation, hit the like button and subscribe right now. Have you ever had to aggressively cut a toxic person out of your life to protect your peace? Share your snort story in the comments below.